AAPS work. It occurs all over the country in offices of doctors like you. We don't have a high-rise building, but AAPS is everywhere. And all of you, I think, are making a tremendous impact on preserving freedom in medicine here. I'd like to tell you a bit about a conference that occurred just about a week ago in this very building. And fortunately for the building, AAPS is here to kind of fumigate the place and maybe exercise it a bit. This was put on by the Banner University Medical Center and the Pima County Medical Society. I think you learned a little bit about Banner from Dr. Lundell yesterday. It has eaten our University Medical Center and probably our medical society as well. And it gave a conference here on the coming storm, Physicians in Healthcare Reform. The dean, who was a former Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Fellow, which we learned about in our lawsuit against the Clinton Healthcare Task Force. It was a very prominent contributor to that. And they gave their view of what's going on in medical care. Some of the take-home points. They had a great slide that I wasn't able to plagiarize, showing 3 big, ugly pigs eating at a trough, which were identified as pharma, America's health insurance plans, and then administration. I think that they were really implying that that other pig had something to do with fee-for-service medicine and private medicine based on some of the remedies that they were talking about, including going to value-based care. One of the doctors who was on a panel afterwards probably made himself really unpopular because he suggested that maybe another pig at that trough might be hospitals. Banner Hospital has a very bad reputation. It charged one patient $7,000 to repair a torn earlobe, which I think some of our members advertises on his website as a $250 job. They're very excited about their new paradigm, which is population health. I'm sure you read about that all the time. It is the antithesis of Hippocratic medicine. Now, I do not see Hippocrates as being a big authority figure, but I see his oath as representing millennia of traditional medical ethics, which is compatible, I think, with Judaism, Christianity, Islam, but it's not compatible with communism or technocracy. It sees the physician is a healer, not a killer, and that he's working for his individual patients, not for the population and the rulers of that population. They have great aspirations for science and technology, including even editing the human genome, and that will fix all of our illnesses and bring medical costs down too. So, of course, other technology we have to ban because that will be too expensive. Their view of reform was compared with a controlled burn that was taking place in Mozambique that our keynote speaker had visited recently. And I think some of the things that are going to go up in that fire are people like you and me. They do claim that exactly 34% of this $3.2 trillion that passes through the, quote, healthcare system is wasted. Maybe it's more than that. They didn't really say how they came up with that number. And so what we need to fix it, we need data. You'd think that maybe they were here for Dr. Patrick Wood's presentation last night, and the data that they're talking about, I think, does not include what we really need, which is honest price signals. They claim, as you have heard over and over and over again, that we spend so much more on healthcare than the civilized nations of the world and get less for it. But we're spending so much, and 34% is wasted, but the remedy is give us more money. And we really have to fight against some of the laws that were in the Senate, such as Graham Cassidy, which would have cut $1 trillion from Medicaid over the next 10 years. I did have an opportunity to ask a question. I said, well, doesn't cut mean in D.C. speech that you've reduced the rate of increase, and that $1 trillion that you don't have, it doesn't exist, it hasn't been printed yet or taken from the taxpayers or borrowed from the creditors. So But nevertheless, they're really worried about Arizona losing $133 billion in additional federal funding for Medicaid, which came through our Medicaid expansion, rammed through the legislature, probably illegally, by our supposedly conservative governor at the time, Jan Brewer. And we can't possibly afford to lose that $133 billion. How will we afford our $1.2 billion construction project, I guess, is the one of the questions you might ask. This was advertised ahead of time as being a great modern technological thing that people in the audience could give their feedback and everybody could participate in the discussion. Well, the opportunity for feedback was an invitation to text one word about healthcare reform, and the words were displayed on the screen by the speaker, and they really featured prominently things like the third one there, which I think kind of gives an idea of the mindset of the students. Many medical students were in the room, after all. There was a huge spread of lavish hors d'oeuvres ahead of the meeting, no doubt paid for by Banner. And that is the sort of thing that where we have to try to get our message across. It's messages like this that are being conveyed by this kind of technology. The dean was asked, well, what do you think about single payer? And he said, well, I'm not really quite for it. I kind of like choice. We have a couple health plans that we can choose from. I've been a registered Republican after all, so I'm kind of against this. And anyway, at the moment, we do not have the votes to get single payer yet. It might take 2 or 4 or 6 years, but evidently this is where they think things are going. Well, I think maybe in order to understand what's going on, it's a good idea to read some old books. I like to make a practice of periodically reading a great chapter called The Grand Inquisitor in Dostoevsky's novel, The Brothers Karamazov. And since there's a new translation out and it's been a long time, I thought I'd reread it and see what the context was. I highly recommend it. It's not like a really rapid page turner like modern novels, but it's about a crime and it's about a trial, and there's so much of intense interest in there for both physicians and lawyers. It was Dostoevsky's last novel. It was serialized in a magazine and published in 1880 and was set in late 19th century Russia. And the ideas that were kind of circulating in the population of that time included socialism. So it was kind of interesting just to read Dostoevsky's take on that. And it raised some of the great questions about faith and doubt. And one of the things it said about socialism is that European liberalism in general, and even our Russian liberal dilettantism, has long and frequently confused the final results of socialism with those of Christianity. So in my opinion, that socialism is kind of a Christian heresy. But the key thing in this book, I think, is a chapter called The Grand Inquisitor. This is a fantasy that was written by one of the brothers, Ivan, who was the intellectual one of the brothers and a great skeptic. And his story was set in Spain at the time of the Spanish Inquisition, when Jesus Christ came back to earth. And what he did was he went around healing people. And he did not have a license. He did not have anybody's permission. He did not collect any data. He did not check any boxes. But the final straw was when he went to a funeral of a beautiful little girl and brought her back to life. Well, the Grand Inquisitor had him arrested immediately. And then the whole chapter is about the Inquisitor telling Christ, how dare you come back to interfere with our work? You just really messed it up. You had this great opportunity that you didn't take advantage of. When the Great Spirit tempted you in the wilderness with the 3 things that you needed to do to fix your creation, you turned them down. And we are here to repair that. Now, of course, Dostoevsky was giving you a Russian Orthodox view of the Roman Catholic Church, but I think that you could really apply this to any of these new ideologies that are going to fix the way the world is and make it better. There could be world communism, or it could be technocracy. Anyway, the principles are the same. The principles are the great wisdom that the devil presented in the desert. The Inquisitor said to Christ, "You want to go into the world, and you are going empty-handed, with some promise of freedom, which they in their simplicity and innate lawlessness cannot even comprehend, which they dread and fear. For nothing has been more insufferable for man and for human society than freedom." Now, as Ivan pointed out in other areas of the novel, that if you do away with the universal lawgiver, really anything is permitted. Do you know that centuries will pass and mankind will proclaim with the mouth of its wisdom and science, boy, maybe he didn't hear of scientism, that there is no crime and therefore no sin, but only hungry men. You hear all the time people saying, well, what good is freedom if people don't have bread? And it took the Polish members of Solidarity to point out that without freedom, you can't get any bread either. You get it from your rulers, who will decide that you get it if they want you to, and those who do not obey will not eat. As long as they remain free, no science will give them bread, but in the end they will lay their freedom at our feet and say to us, "Better that you enslave us, but feed us." But mankind still does have a conscience, or some of them do, and what they need is an authority to appease their conscience and convince them that they're really doing the right thing, and to figure out for them what is the right thing for the good of society that they ought to do. And of course we see this attack on individual physicians' consciences all the time here in American medicine. And the thing that you need, that the organization needs, is 100% consensus. As pointed out, if you disagree with us, well, we have to get rid of you. You have to be punished if you dissent from us on things that science has settled. And for the care of these pitiful creatures is not just to find something for which I or some other man can bow down, but to find something that everyone else will also have to bow down to. And of course, you may find that if you ask questions in a meeting with the one that I went to, it makes them really, really uncomfortable, which makes you think that, well, maybe that's exactly what you need to do. I think it's timely for us to consider some of the lessons that were learned from the recent attack in Las Vegas, particularly from the words of this media babe who lost her job for saying out loud what probably a lot of other people in this country really were thinking. And that is, we don't really have any sympathy for those people who were gunned down. They were country western fans. They were probably gun-toting Trump supporters. So really, mass slaughter is kind of okay as long as it's the right kind of people being slaughtered. You didn't hear anybody whispering anything like that about the slaughter that occurred in the Orlando nightclub. And of course, immediately the event is seized upon as a pretext for more gun control, although you have to ask, well, what good did gun control do us, or would have done even more of it, have done to prevent this episode? But mass slaughter, I mean, if once you accept the premise as it's a way of making things better, then where does it stop? The 20th century, after all, was famous for mass slaughter, not of just hundreds of people at a time, but 100 million people at a time. And when do these progressives talk about, the consequences of world communism and all the people that it slaughtered, and where is our stopping point if we're going to have a collectivist society? Many methods were used. Shooting was certainly a good one. Not just hundreds, but 22,000 Poles were slaughtered by Soviets and buried in mass graves, say in Katyn Forest, and our progressives have never really come to grips with that kind of slaughter. Poison gas was, of course, favored by Hitler, and probably carbon monoxide was the most common thing. But the most effective and cost-effective method of all, that probably killed more than anybody, was just starvation. The Soviets used it to kill the best farmers in Europe so that they could collectivize agriculture in the Ukraine. One of Hitler's famous methods was to just herd people into an enclosure out in the open and deprive them of food and water. You had to come every now and then and haul out the dead bodies, but people did reliably, 100% of them died. So knowing a little history like that, it makes me a little concerned when I see starvation and dehydration as actual part of physicians' orders. And these are some of the things that Zudi Jasser and Ron Panzer and many of us have been speaking out against as being brought into effect under the cover, a cloak of presumed palliative care, presumed compassion and mercy. We can carry out these methods one at a time, or we can carry them out en masse. When Solzhenitsyn was asked, how did the Soviets manage to get 1 million citizens to send off to the Gulag? And he said, they came for us, one at a time. So if we want to, how do you get rid of 1/4 of the younger generation of a country? You abort them one at a time. To get some insight into the mindset of the people who are promoting this philosophy, it may help to look at who the heroes are of some of the villains. And I think everyone would agree that Hitler was maybe number one villain, at least the number one acknowledged villain. And his heroes included Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, and American academic eugenicists. He just put some of their ideas into practice that we didn't quite get around to doing here yet. I think there are also some lessons we can learn from the Congressional ballgame, which was another use of slaughter for probably a political motive. Fortunately, the carnage there was stopped by somebody who had a gun. And maybe it would have been stopped sooner if there had been more citizens there who were properly equipped and properly trained with the type of training that you might get at Front Sight. And you might want to talk to Bob McQueenie about his generous offer of a membership in Front Sight. But there's another thing there that we might learn from this. I think if you've been to a lot of CME conferences, a question that they ask you there is, well, what did you learn that affects your practice? Tell us how this activity helps your practice. And I say, oh. But I've been to one activity that did not have CME credit, that was taught at a physician's meeting by a person a lot of the doctors really disapproved of, and it's one that I really have implemented. The speaker's name was Charles Heller. He's an expert on gun laws and a CCW instructor. Most interesting part of his presentation, I thought, was displaying the contents of his pockets, or some of his pockets. And one of the things that he had was something like this. You know what that is? Anybody? It's got a little thing like this on the edge. It's a Velcro thing. That is a tourniquet. And we may say kudos to the surgeons who operated on Congressman Scalise, but they had a patient only because some unsung hero at the scene stopped his hemorrhage. So Mr. Heller has this in his pocket. And I thought, well, how many of you even have one of these things? Okay, how many of you have one with you? Well, I got to thinking, mine's been riding around in my truck for quite a while, but I couldn't possibly find it fast enough to do any good with it. But it can bleed to death pretty fast. And I think this is kind of a metaphor for what we're fighting against in American medicine. There's all kinds of problems, but first we've got to stop the hemorrhage. Just the hemorrhage of all of the treasure that is being lost by these plans that simply add to our expenses and don't work. So one of the things we took up recently, partly inspired by our experience at this seminar that was held here, is our Singlepayer IQ test. How do we get through this indoctrination that the students had? You know, people go insane in mobs and they come to their senses one at a time. And one way, you need to get them thinking for themselves, and sometimes asking a question will help. The first questions are, who is a single payer? What if the single payer doesn't pay? And we would like the poster child to be Charlie Gard, not Billy Kimmel, for single payer medicine. Who will do the work with all these doctors who are quitting, or who are actually the best doctors being kicked out by all of these science experts? Whom does the single payer pay? And we're putting on our website printable things that have like one page front and back that you can distribute to your friends. We need your help to get the message out. Well, there is a lot of work to be done, and we have many, many tools at our disposal now. We have not yet been reduced to samizdat. That Vladimir Bukovsky explained was samizdat. I write it myself, edit it myself, censor it myself, publish it myself, distribute it myself, and spend jail time in it for it by myself. But before we get to that point, we have to use every effort to get the word out, to plant the seeds here and there and everywhere. This needs to be done, and it's up to you. Thank you.